Welcome to our discussion today, where we are hosting IDS Sussex as they celebrate their 60 years of existence. IDS Nairobi here just celebrated 61 years last year, and we are happy to welcome Professor Ian Scoones from IDS Sussex and Professor Paul Kamau from IDS Nairobi. With me is my colleague Tahira Mohamed, who is also a researcher here in Kenya working at Jameel Observatory and an alumni of IDS Sussex. My name is Rahma Hassan, a researcher here in Kenya, but most importantly, an alumni of IDS Nairobi.
Yeah. So for this conversation, we are asking question, what is the future of development studies? And I invite my co-host Rahma to take us through this conversation.
It's very exciting to have this conversation with all of you 60 years later, 61st anniversary for our IDS University of Nairobi. Ian Scoones, who's been working with us here in many fronts, and Professor Paul Kamau is director of the institute. So 60 plus years later, this is an interesting and important turning point for us to think back and discuss the future of development studies at a time when so much has changed in the world. These two institutes have had a long-standing collaboration, and this is a time to also think about the future together. So much is being challenged. How can development be reimagined for today's context? And how can universities teach development studies that fits the changing development context? So welcome everybody, and we hope we can think ahead into the future based on the research and our engagements in different fronts.
Thank you again. So now we will invite Professor Paul Kamau to briefly provide historical context of this institution, especially for IDS University of Nairobi, and then Professor Ian to reflect on the institution and where they are in terms of research and development.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me in this podcast and to converse and agree or discuss major issues relating to development studies today and the world in which we operate in. As you have already said, my name is Paul Kamau, and I'm currently serving as the Director of Research at the University of Nairobi Institute for Development Studies. I would say that this year IDS is 61 years, having been established way back in 1965. So we are very proud to be partnering with IDS at the University of Sussex, which is not a new partner in our operation. IDS Sussex has been, and many people think is the mother, but it happens the mother is older than the daughter. But having said that, IDS Sussex has been very instrumental at the formation and the growth of IDS Nairobi. Just to highlight a few areas of collaboration, that partnership has existed for many years. I remember 20 years ago when IDS Sussex was celebrating 40 years, IDS Nairobi was 41 years. We had a joint event here in Nairobi to commemorate the two institutions. During that time, as you all know, we say life began at 40, and 20 years later we are here. It's a year of perfection. When you turn 60, it's when you look back and say, what have we achieved and how do you soldier on going forward? So just to highlight that IDS, initially established as a department within the Ministry of Planning in the independent government in 1965, was very active in developing pro-growth policies in this country and in the region. When University of Nairobi again was established in 1970, IDS was moved as a think tank within the university, but conducting research independently. So IDS is a multidisciplinary institute and therefore has a combination of discipline and skills, a trait that has enabled to navigate in many terrains, be it in governance, be it in economics, social, and even in anthropological matters. One turning point of IDS was in 1970 when the Institute of African Studies was hired from IDS to become another research institute. By this time, IDS played a critical role in focusing on rural development, because that was the major blueprint of the government at that point. So in terms of developing policies for agriculture development, cooperative movement, and more importantly, human capital development, IDS played a very important role. This went on until about 1984, when we saw major reforms in the country as a result of structural adjustment program. And one sector that was heavily affected by this was education. IDS, I would like to mention, also was very instrumental in developing the MSC's policy, Micro and Small Enterprises policy, that has guided operation of the informal sector in the country. So in 1980s, IDS continued with its mandate of undertaking research in many areas within the social facet of development. So within the period of 1980 to 2000, IDS focused a lot on education reforms, pro-poor growth model, poverty reduction, and more importantly, social protection, which are important for development. In 1990s, there was a drive towards improving governance in the country and in the region, and IDS was very instrumental in developing or in political arena of multi-party democracy in this country. In fact, most of the researchers who were spearheading civil society agitation for democracy in the country, that saw in 1990 the repeal of Section 2A of the Constitution allowing multi-party democracy in the country. The IDS was involved in that. Let me mention that in the recent past, when the country was going through the new constitution dispensation that saw the culmination or promulgation of new constitution in 2010, IDS was heavily involved in the constitution making. In fact, two of our colleagues in IDS were among the eminent persons who were involved in developing new constitution. If I may mention here, Professor Karuti Kanyinga and Professor Njuguna Ngede served in those committees. So in 2000 also, IDS began a training program, first to the Masters in Development Studies, and then which transformed into Master of Development Studies in 2016. In 2004, we began our PhD program that is now almost 20 years, and we have trained through the essays quite a pool of development thinkers. So initially we depended a lot on IDS Sussex, where most of my earlier colleagues trained for their masters and PhD. So this has strengthened our relationship. We've done a lot of collaborative research with IDS Sussex, which has really strengthened our collaboration and partnership. So as we look forward to what is in the future, I would say the development and development studies are in crisis. We need to redefine ourselves and see how best we can remain relevant, current to the current dispensation in development. There are a lot of changes which come with risk, and we need to align ourselves better for purposes of continuing with the discussion on development studies as a discourse. Thank you very much.
Thanks, and it's a great pleasure to be here, and Paul, thank you for welcoming us to the University of Nairobi. As you say, the relationships between the two IDSs, our big brother here in Kenya, and the small, the youngster in Sussex, has been a long one, and right from the very beginning. Going right back to the beginning, I wasn't there then. I've actually been at IDS in Sussex for 31 years, which is a little bit shocking, but I wasn't there 60 years ago. I was only 4, I think. Back then it was established as a training institute to train government officials in the newly independent nations around the world. It was a commitment to the British, which obviously were responsible for colonialism, to at least redress some of that and think about what nation building meant. And I think it was in those eras when we had a lot of people coming back and forth from Kenya and elsewhere to Sussex, when that was its original focus. Under the initial directorship of Dudley Sears, it developed a research program, very similar actually, around what you were doing in in Nairobi, which was an attempt to try and develop a sort of pro-poor, growth-orientated strategy for new development. And that developed into a whole series of research programs which are familiar to many people around the world. Initially, the focus of research at IDS Sussex was about the global south. It was called the third world in those days, a rather demeaning term. But actually, now I think we think of development very much as a north-south question. The questions of inequality, of social justice, of environmental change affect us everywhere. It's a universal challenge, and I think that's when we think about where development goes, we can think about those type of international solidarities that are essential. But some turning points and highlights you asked about. Well, I think probably the most famous, and again this has Kenya connections as well, of IDS's fellows who've been involved in research over so many years is the work on participation, and Robert Chambers, of course, who spent many years in Kenya, initially as a district commissioner, in fact, in the colonial era, and subsequently as a researcher and mountaineer. But the work on participation, participatory rural appraisal, and that whole thinking about what rural development means, I think was very important for the world, but also for Kenya. You mentioned the whole debate in the 1990s about structural adjustment, and there was a key book that came out from IDS in Sussex called States and Markets, which was a classic, which was in a way a critique of what became known as the Washington Consensus, that neoliberal version of adjustment that became central to World Bank policy, but was critiqued by organisations like IDS in Nairobi and IDS Sussex, as there was a debate then. A strand of work that I think has been very important in Sussex's work, which I think has spread to different places, has been on livelihoods, the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework, and many people are familiar with that, emerging again in the early 90s and developed through the 1990s into the 2000s, a way of thinking about rural development, not as a set of external policies, but about thinking about what happens from below, what happens in real places. And of course that has influenced all the work on social protection, which, as you said, is an important strand of work here. And then, rather belatedly actually, for the wider debate, IDS has developed a very strong area of work on environment and sustainability, established in the early 90s with the environment group there that's carried on. I could mention many more. I mean, there's a fantastic group working on tax at the moment. There's been great work on global health. I mean, IDS at Sussex has been has had a set of research areas that has changed over time, but it's always, I think, been one that's been critical, challenging received wisdoms. It's been based on academic research, but engaged academic research, working together with people on the ground, and linked to teaching, critically linked to teaching. Our students, initially through what was an MPhil, a 2-year master's program, and then subsequently a series of MAs, have been absolutely crucial to the vibrancy and the set of relationships we have around the world. And of course the PhD program that Tahira was involved in has been important. So I think, IDS in a small little way has been influential, but only influential through partnerships, and partnerships that happen in places like Kenya, but also around the world. But as you say, Paul, I mean, development to some extent is in crisis. We started in the 1960s at a period of transition in the world from a colonial era to a post-colonial era, when there was commitment, in the case of the UK, from a Labour government. Barbara Castle was the minister who established the Institute. Now we have a government in the UK where aid and development is simply not on the agenda. For years it was a cross-party consensus. This was part of Britain's mission in the world as a small country and a former colonial power. But now it seems to have disappeared. So we have to make the argument together, I think, in the international debate about the importance of development as a theme and development studies as an area of inquiry and research and teaching.
Thank you very much. Taking us down memory lane, but also highlighting some important turning points for these two institutes. As a student myself at IDS Nairobi, I remember these texts, putting the last first, putting the first last. Important conversations for graduate students, but also for practice, because we always go back to the basics now in our work around development. But Ian and Paul, maybe we could also take this conversation forward on development in crisis and think about some contemporary issues and pressure and challenges facing development and development studies. What are some key insights and issues around many topics: climate crisis, geopolitics? We've talked about decolonizing development, and the tensions around how we are engaging in these two, both global north and global south. So maybe you can reflect a bit more on this in terms of the contemporary issues and pressures we are facing.
I'll go first? Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, I think development as an idea does and must have a future. I mean, to me, development is thinking about what is good change, what's progressive transformation, what is socially just. And these questions are just as relevant as they were 60 years ago, but in a different context. They're challenges that are central to environmental change. If we're going to think about how we address climate change, we've got to think about just transitions, just transformations. If we think about the rise of right-wing authoritarian populism, which is affecting parts of the world as we speak, we've got to think about how new forms of democracy, new forms of citizen action can challenge those issues. If we think about artificial intelligence and the rise of a sort of technological future, we've also got to think about how we can have progressive pathways of change within that technological future. So I think it remains highly relevant, but in new contexts. And I think many of the things that we've been thinking about over time, you mentioned, putting the last first, developing things from the ground up, thinking about context and livelihoods, still remain as relevant as ever. And we've got to use that legacy of our institutes for new settings. Because, there are new structural political processes within politics, within technologies, within environmental change that are affecting us dramatically. And as I said, these are issues that are not parcelled off to the global south or the global north. These are universal challenges and should be brought together in an internationalist perspective. But I think there are some important changes in ways of thinking that we have to encompass. I mean, both our institutes started off in a period of sort of statist development. There was a sort of idea of what development was. The state was going to deliver it. It was the independent states of Africa and elsewhere. And it was a quite static perspective, both of economics and politics. And very often that sort of modernist, liberal view about how things should be was how we understood development. I remember, reading the textbooks of years ago, and whether that was in the statist versions of the 60s and 70s or the market-orientated versions of the 80s and 90s, it was still quite static, still quite linear. But I think now one of the big challenges for us, whether it's environmental change, political change, technological change is that the systems we're dealing with as development thinkers and practitioners are so much more complex, they're so much more uncertain, they're so much more connected. And we really have to think about how we manage such complex systems in different ways. And I think that's a real challenge for our interdisciplinary focus, because we're both, development studies is an interdisciplinary enterprise. It's not a discipline per se. It's an interdisciplinary connection of ideas. And we need to use that to challenge the way we think about environmental change, about technology and so on, and bring in new disciplines, new ways of thinking. And that's about using multiple knowledges, different knowledges, bringing knowledges from the ground up, decolonizing our knowledge systems, and thinking about how development is reconstructed around these new challenges, around complexity, uncertainty, and diverse knowledges. And I think there's a real future for us there, if we can rethink.
Thank you. Paul, over to you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ian, for that a very insightful conversation, and thank you very much for this ongoing debate. Allow me just to mention that I, as a researcher, have been very privileged to work with several colleagues in IDS Sussex, and especially in my line of work where we're looking at industrialization, the development of global value chains, for example, with Rafi Kaplinski, Herbert Scholz, and other colleagues in IDS Sussex really propelled the work, and especially in 2000, where we're also looking at what does it mean for Asian drivers. That time is when China had just been acceded into WTO. We had India also becoming a prominent power in development dispensation. And therefore, the work on global value chains remain very relevant. And actually, that's what we need to be looking at today, that sure, the challenges that confronted the world in 1945 after the Second World War, and where development as a concept came to be, still persists. But I agree very much with Ian that they are existing, but in a different context and in different dispensation. And therefore, for us to agree or for us to chart our way forward, we need to rethink how do we remain relevant and accurate to developing new knowledge that inform current context of development. For sure, the definition of development is not going to change. It's about bringing out that progressive change. How do we improve on the well-being? When you look at issues of inequality, issues of democracy, even after the multi-party systems in developing countries came in, we're seeing a lot of reversal in terms of democratization process. And one of our projects that we are doing on Afrobarometer shows that even though we are priding Africa as democratic, we are seeing a lot of distraction, a lot of moving back to authoritarian system. So for that reason, even as we look at the emerging issues, I don't want to downplay the element of climate change, and IDS University of Nairobi has been very active in this space. In fact, one of the programs we have in the module for development studies is on environmental risk and natural resource management, and climate change is now hitting on all of us, and therefore this is an area we need to pay more attention to it. We need to start looking at how can we mitigate. And I know, Rahma, you're aware of the project RARE. We have Jukan project that we are currently implementing, looking at how can we mitigate challenges of climate change. And therefore, this is an area we need to look at. When we talk of human rights as a way of governance and general governance and democratization process, on our continent is an area that we need to be more active and to participate more actively towards bringing in new insight. And therefore, even though I began by saying that development study is in crisis, it is a high time for us to rethink and see how do we re-engineer ourselves. Is it redefining development? Is it re-looking at the way we approach development? Because we need to have and to bring voices of the masses more. And I agree totally with Ian that we need to even see how more can we bring voices of the majority, right? Participatory development. It's like it has been washed away. We need to go back and see how can we make people become the definers of their destiny. So even you look at the Kenyan Constitution, just to highlight, the issue of public participation has been given a lot of prominence. But in practice, is it happening? Right? People or system are just using public participation as a tick box. But how can we have effective conversation with majority of people in terms of determining where and how development is implemented? Allow me to mention that digital transformation is here with us, the AI, and for that reason, we cannot ignore, because we will not continue carrying out research, teaching, doing our training in the same way and not become cognizant of the changing environment in tech industry. For that reason, we need also to be at the forefront of AI. It's affecting many ways in which things are done. And for that reason, even in development studies going forward, we may not ignore AI as a major transformation in the way we are conducting research. Finally, allow me just to bring in the issue of cross-disciplinarity in our research work. I am aware that IDS Sussex and IDS Nairobi as multidisciplinary institution host many disciplines within them. And it is true, development studies is not a single discipline. It's a combination, an aggregation, and conglomeration of many disciplines. How far are we able to bring? For the longest, we have just been dealing with social science discipline. I think it's the high time we brought in the natural science, the STEM, into thinking about development. For example, in IDS for the last 5 years, we have been implementing a project on transport system in the country. And it's because we have seen, we have engineers who are designing road for motor vehicles with total disregard of pedestrian and other non-motorized users. So we have been working with partners in the transport industry to bring the human face into the engineering, right? We need to bring the nuclear science. We need to bring the chemists and physicists of this world so that as we think development, then we're bringing them together so that we do not design this that works for medical or for engineering part, then the human nature is not happening. A good example is when we had the COVID. The scientists were busy developing vaccination. But when you talk to people on the ground, the myth and the culture about taking those vaccinations made the utilization to be very low. Why? Because there was no social aspect in the medical field of developing this vaccination. So bringing this discipline together may help us to even address global challenges in a more holistic way. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. Really a lot to digest, and also now coming back to ourselves, the two alumni from the University of Sussex and IDS, University of Nairobi. And here I go to my colleague Rahma. A lot has been said around governance, democracy, public participation, and how linking development to like governance in the countries. So what does this mean for researchers like us in this country and also all over? Plus also, how can this also influence curriculum development for both institutes, considering the transition from where the two institutions came from, what they were doing, plus also the current development situation whereby we have so many crises, and linking this to what is our role like as a next generation kind of like researchers?
Thank you, Tahira and colleagues. One of the things that I'd like to pick up from your conversation, Ian and Paul, is the idea of inclusion and how development is shifting. And I think in tapping into this shift, one of the things we need to think about is how early career researchers or globally researchers in the global south can also bring in the new energy through different solidarities in different movements and critical agrarian studies on how we can ground these collaborations in local knowledge and also ensure that the topic of power and inclusion and the people who are left out in many of these development debates and conversations are brought to the center. So in rebalancing these partnerships, the curriculums must change. There is no option for that. And also ensuring that the research community, the administrative university and the academic university can have this shared vision where we have equitable ways in which we make representation, but also practical opportunities to explore with local people and local institutions that are closest to the people. In this way, we need to leave the ivory tower, as they normally say, and think of connecting with grassroots through the different connections. So I think the relations we are trying to go back to between these two institutions are the same relations we need to build with local organizations, local research institutes, and other global south and global north organizations that share into this future vision for development studies. And this is how the curriculums should be shifting towards making sure these connections come to life. And this also means a new role for graduate students of development studies, a new role for the universities and for those who teach development studies. In thinking about this interdisciplinary approach, we also need to think about how we can shape this field through as advocates or scholar activists, like we say at the collective of agrarian scholars from the global south, a global movement in the south, people who work in different fields, but also linking with rural communities. And I think this is where I see an opportunity for graduate education and local organizations. I think a recent collaboration, Paul, between IDS Nairobi and the Center for Research and Development in the Drylands during the IDS at 60 celebration is an example of how to tap into what's happening in pastoral areas in the north, back into the university, and listening to the people who are closer to where people are experiencing the climate crisis, for instance. So that's, for me, Tahira, I think would be an entry point. And what do you think about this, Tahira, from your own work? And I think we've been doing the similar work with you and others in the north. What do you see as some opportunities or research priorities and for students and graduates thinking about your work and your colleagues from IDS Sussex and the different areas they are pursuing?
Thank you so much, Rahma. In today's conversation, we are talking about what is the future of development, bringing together the two IDS, Sussex at the University of Sussex and IDS University of Nairobi. So for me, Rahma, there are a few things, and number one is about the methods that was put out earlier there about participation, rural appraisal. Today, all this methodological approach in terms of the research for development or even development studies, these methods are really important even today. Of course, they'll have so many names, different names, participatory scenario development, public participation, all of these things is something that is important. And as researchers, it's also really essential that we use that in our engagement. And for researchers, especially for the Global South, and in collaboration with Global North, one thing I really want to emphasize is capacity building, and in terms of critical thinking, not just linking, not just in terms of the theoretical background of what development studies is and how it can be used, but how can this critical thinking and all the issues that was mentioned about governance, public participation, social justice, climate justice, and just transition, how can all this debate be meaningful in terms of practically applying in rural development, in state making, and also in public governance? And in this, I think one of the things that I really inherited from IDS Sussex and also through the Pastor's program is this idea of summer school, practically bringing together like practitioners, the student from different development program and even other disciplinary program like anthropology, sociology, all of this, and then we critically think together, where are we as a society? And what do you think research can bring in terms of improving development and making sure that we are progressing in a way we want to progress? And then another thing also, by extension, I was also alumni from University of Nairobi. I did my master's here, and I also did my undergrad in anthropology here. And for me, one of the challenges as a student from this part of the world is access to resources. In terms of, for example, papers and publications, sometimes you want to do research but you don't have that access. How can this collaboration between these universities improve access to resources? Could there be maybe interest in having, let's say, exchange program, bringing students from, let's say, this other side to this other side, kind of developing a position paper on particular development crisis? It can be on climate justice, it can be, global conflict crisis and these things. And in this kind of exchange program, students would get access to resources and materials, but also try to change ideas. And finally, through the work that I have been doing with colleagues at the International Livestock Research Institute and Jameel Observatory, is linking research with decision making, especially with government. For us, what we are doing is organizing policy dialogue with governors, members of parliament, trying to bring this research. What is development? What does public participation mean? And then we have this conversation. How is drought, for example, managed? What does looking at drought from community perspective means? Having this discussion as it is, as raw as it is, with these policymakers, and trying to influence how they make decisions and how they invest in, for example, supporting rural development is something I think we need to do, and we have a lot to do as young researchers. And then for this now, turn over to Rahma to take us to the next session for this.
Thank you so much, Tahira. This summary around how we need to have graduate students with a skill set to move development in the next generation, but also these critical skills that are required to analyze and think about power, inclusion, politics, and institutions. Those are important entry points, including the ones Tahira mentions of some opportunities to work with others in the field. So we turn back to Paul and Ian now to think about some important moments to reflect going forward. So what are some areas of collaboration? I think Tahira has mentioned some ideas around exchange programs, but what do you see as ways in which we can include local communities, in ways in which we can go back to the basics, ideas for the future? Paul.
Well, thank you very much. Quite a strong point to think through and mind-boggling in terms of how do we move forward. One is that our mandate as an institute remain to carry out research, to do training, and that is in capacity building, and more importantly also to provide consulting work. So allow me to mention that we need, as you rightly observe, we need to be reviewing our curriculum regularly. And one way is to be developing programs and curriculum that is relevant for the time and the day when we are implementing. Partnerships are very important, and for sure we need to keep strengthening and building partnership between our existing collaborators and even the new ones, because you will get new ways of doing things when you are collaborating and partnering with other institutions. And let me continue echoing emphasizing how our collaboration with IDS Sussex has been instrumental in developing our research agenda as well. Allow me to add another area is also to have joint or dual degree programs where one can be from the south but you benefit from support in the north. And we have good examples where we have had these joint or dual or double degree programs, and it helps researchers from the north to build capacity of the south with full recognition, as opposed to where you just being looked at providers of resources. For sure, the aid architecture is changing globally, and the geopolitics are affecting how development is going to be implemented. We should not be oblivious of the local local knowledge, and that's why IDS is very keen even in strengthening our relationship with grassroots organizations like CRDD. We are already working with Impact Kenya in terms of looking at livelihood solution from the ground as opposed to sitting in the ivory tower and prescribing. So that's another area that we are working on, and I want to echo the work that CRDD and Impact Kenya are doing based in the North region or Northern County region, where for the longest time there was a lot of exclusion. So how can we tap into this knowledge? Finally, there's need for us to start rethinking local resource mobilization. I think development research or development practice has for a long time depended on resources flowing from the north to the south. It's important because the resources are huge, they can be impactful, but with the changing geopolitics and declining aid architecture, local solutions need to start emerging for supporting research. How can we partner, especially with local and philanthropists, local companies to finance development thinking and research? I think the more we are able to move away from dependence to mobilizing resources locally, the more we are going to have well and self-driven research agenda, as opposed to waiting for a call from maybe the FCDO, from IDRC, and the development partners of this world who are engineering, who are spearheading the research agenda. If you have your own resources, then it is possible to decide which research to undertake. Finally, is to also promote research partnership by way of staff exchanges. So it's a good thing to look at capacity building, but also having a research exchange program between the global south and global north, so that we can be at the frontier of knowledge generation in the current period of development. Allow me to mention that when we are thinking of this partnership, then we need to bring in equality. Sometimes partnerships are based on financial resources, and therefore you have the power and more powerful and less powerful. But the more we bring mutuality, so that even if it's not about resources, but equity in terms of what you bring on the table, will be very helpful in strengthening knowledge generation and development studies discourse development into the future. Thank you.
I couldn't agree more. I think that mutuality and respect for a balanced power relationship in exchange and collaboration is absolutely the root of it. And although we're sad about the loss of funding, sometimes the restructuring of funding may require us to think in new ways, just as you say, for local resource mobilization, but also to think about, well, what are the relationships, what are the mutual benefits that we can gain from collaborating with each other, not just as channeling of funding, which has often been the case. But I think, as both of you have said as well, I think one of our real challenges going forward is to rethink the nature of the partnerships on which development as a project is thought about. Because, going back right to the beginning of IDS at Sussex, it was a training institute for government officials. Well, that era has gone. We need now to think about, well, what are the new types of partnerships that we need to develop? You mentioned, early career researchers and solidarity with social movements in a scholar activist tradition. You mentioned You know, the importance of dialogues with government and debates within government. As researchers, as practitioners, we need to be in there developing these partnerships and developing them in ways that push a critical agenda. These are not partnerships for its own sake. These are partnerships to push ideas, to push change, to push progressive positions. But I think we need to, as everyone has said, rethink the curriculum, rethink the way that we go about what development is. And this means moving from it being just a global south thing to being a universal thing, from going from a technocratic, solutions-orientated approach to being one about thinking about systems and complexity, from being essentially a top-down status model or market-driven model to being one that is ground up, that is participatory, that is rooted in local context. And I think a lot of this means getting out to the field more. I think a lot of people in research these days, partly because of lack of funding, don't know what's happening in pastoral areas in the north. They don't know what's happening in coastal communities or wherever. And I think one of the real challenges in collaboration with people on the ground is to learn more, to bring the realities of thinking. Because if we are to challenge whose knowledge counts, again to use a Robert Chambers term, we have to know where that knowledge is coming from and interact with it. And I think there's too little grounded research of people getting their hands dirty, if you like, out in the field and thinking with communities about change. But I think, as we think ahead to a more mutual form of exchange, a more mutual form of partnership, we should think about the mechanisms of staff exchanges, student exchanges, and so on. But in the end, this is going to need resources. We have to mobilise these resources locally, but we also have to make the case much more assertively, I think, rather than sort of complaining, oh no, we haven't got any aid money anymore, but actually saying, look, we can offer something really useful for the government of Kenya, for the government of the UK, which is about a partnership that's about mutual learning, that is good for the Kenyan government, it's good for the UK government. Because as the world reconfigures, the relationships between countries based on these type of interactions become more and more important politically, in terms of international relations, in terms of geopolitics. And if development as a project can be at the centre of that, then it should be at the centre of foreign policy, it should be at the centre of international trade, it should be at the centre of global technological futures. And that's why an interdisciplinary approach that is so central to development studies, going, as you say, beyond the social sciences to the STEM subjects. I mean, I studied as a biologist originally, so I'm an example of somebody who can move between disciplines. But if we are going to be thinking about global pandemics, AI, transport engineering, the examples that you gave, we do need engineers and global health people and epidemiologists and ecologists and so on board. And that's why, as I said before, I think a systems approach, a complexity-orientated approach, an approach that embraces uncertainty, is so essential as we rethink what development is in a new world. I'll leave it there. Mm-hmm. I could go on, but I won't.
The professor, yes.
Professors can go on and on. Yeah.
Wow, thank you so much. Really wonderful. For me, from this conversation, one thing I am getting is how bold these research institutions are, like how bold you can talk about, different topics that is affecting the globe, the world that we are living in, from class, gender, generation, AI, social justice. All these things gives us an opportunity to be the knowledge broker between the policy makers, the local communities that we've been working. And I think we have this great opportunity that we can use to transition from where we started and where we want to go. And this brings me to the final session of this podcast to talk about the future of development studies. So for both Professor Ian and Paul, what is one big shift development needs in the next 10 to 20 years? That one critical shift that this space needs in terms of like the last 10, 20 years. I know it's so much, but then as professors, I know you have a special way of bringing this together, telling us one big shift that development studies need in the next like 10, 20 years.
Thought,
Just one.
Well, one is to say that this conversation should not be an end in itself. And I would say that as development studies discourse, we should strive not to do research just for the sake of it. We should be looking forward to doing research that informs our teaching and also policy. Sometimes we lack the platform to influence policy, but that is one area where development studies is much more needed, because you look at many of our countries, especially in the global south, a lot of decisions are being made without proper evidence and without articulated research. Why? Because politicians think academicians are just theorizers. So the more we're able to penetrate that policy discussion and also integrate our training into our research, such that our students are part of our research process, and I'm happy that both of you have said you benefited from ongoing research in a way that make you perceive the world differently rather than just sitting and waiting for data to be collected. I like in some of the fieldwork that I've gone with Rahma here, you see her now struggling to get into this and getting data. You find a lot of energy, right? So the more we integrate our students in the research we do, and then we don't do research as an end in itself, but as a means to some end, the better. I really look forward to our celebrating 70 and 80 years. I don't know whether we shall be there, but we need to move the legacy forward. Thank you very much for having me in this conversation.
So this is a big challenge, eh? Yeah, this is the revenge of the student on the professor, right? What's your one answer?
Yeah.
Well, you're going to guess. You're probably already guess what my one contribution is going to be. I'm a bit one-tracked on this. I think if development studies embraces the idea of uncertainty, where we don't know what we don't know about the future of the world, it could help us rethink in a whole array of domains, whether that's on economics and trade, on global health, on environment. Because if we genuinely have a sense of doubt, a sense of skepticism, a sense of not quite knowing what the world will be, we can be a little bit more humble, a little bit more reflexive, a little bit more able to think about the world as a complex system which we don't have easy solutions for. Because development studies was born, as we've discussed already, of this modernist, liberal vision where we knew what the world should be. And confidently, often as rather arrogant, as academics in the ivory tower, we said, that's what you should do. It hasn't quite worked in many senses, and there's been a lot of failures of so-called development, partly because of that, partly because we haven't embraced the uncertainties that are out there, and that we wanted to control, we wanted to manage, we wanted to have singular solutions. If we open that up and we say there are multiple pathways to sustainability, to development, then I think we can get a different way of doing things. So that can be more collaborative. We can work with people on the ground, with pastoralists in northern Kenya. We can work with policymakers and say, how is your problem? How does it look from your sense? And then help people through. And I think a lot of the methodologies that Tahira, you mentioned as important in your thinking about development studies can then be useful in that. And I think it is quite a big paradigmatic shift from the conventional old-style development to something new. And I think it's one that we should be encouraging our students and thinking more broadly about. And yeah, I hope, although I'm not going to be kicking around at IDS at Sussex for the 120th anniversary, let alone the 70th or 80th, but hopefully our institutions can reinvent themselves to have that future, which I think is a positive one. It's a universal one, and it's an exciting and fun one. So you guys are the ones who can carry it forward, not old people like me. But thank you for the invitation to the podcast, both of you. And happy to celebrate our older sibling as well as the younger one on the 60th and 61st anniversaries.
Wow, happy anniversary to both IDSs, and we're really honored to be part of these two institutions. So I think it's also time for me and Rahma to bring our thoughts together on this, and I'll start by going back to where we started, especially around how the two institutions emerged, like as a think tank, as a government training, like advisory institution, and today where we are, like, because the foundation is really important as like who makes decision and what does inclusive decision making mean. So for me, for example, one thing that I learned through IDS is the program on social protection, and looking at where we are today, global debt crisis, especially for like region in these countries, and then how the shifting aid priorities, and how can development studies and practitioners in this space like be of use in this like situation whereby we're sitting on one hand, the government in these countries are facing really huge crisis, and then on the other side, on the other side there's shifting priorities. And for me, I think one idea around social protection is can contribute to this discussion. And why am I saying this? For example, in Somalia, where we've been having like many crises, diaspora humanitarian, diaspora remittances has been really helpful. And when Professor was mentioning local forms of solidarities and local forms of, resource mobilization, how can social protection programming, where government leadership and ownership and, institutionalization of this program is really advocated as key area of like that need improvement. So how can this conversation, the two of them, be brought together, especially by this like research institution? I think IDS University of Nairobi can borrow some expertise from IDS Sussex on areas about social protection, tax and governance, so that at least we can influence the conversation from the community's perspective, from local forms of solidarity and resource mobilization, so that we can own and you can own and also develop our communities and our societies from using our resources. Because if you look at the humanitarian, like diaspora humanitarian for the past years, 2022, 2024, in Somalia alone, it was more than $1 billion US. So you can imagine the resources that is coming informally through local networks. So how can all this research be abridged so that this can be supported by, for example, national policies? It can be given a space that it can progress well without really undermining it or, for example, damaging it by enforcing tax and other rules like that. And then finally, to end my thought on this is, I repeat again, I said this earlier, is through collaboration with public institutions. For example, where I said the Jameel Observatory, we developed something called Drylands Futures Academy. And this Drylands Futures Academy has different pathway for students to develop their academic curriculum. So, for example, collaborating with local universities like Garissa University, for example, Borana University, so that you can build their capacities, because University of Nairobi setting university has more resource, more capacity, more personnel. So how can you support the local universities so that their curriculum can be informed, you can have that practical network. And then, for example, another component of the Drylands Futures Academy is pathway for supporting the, local leaders like governors, MPs, directors, the practitioners who are working in this situation, because the ideals of development studies and where both institutions were formed is supporting government, supporting the community, and really having that inclusive public participation. And I turn over to my colleague Rahma. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tahira. So much to say as we close, but one of the things that I picked from your conversations is around about our own contributions as upcoming researchers. We have the privilege of people who have spent so much time and energy. We are grateful to all the researchers around the world who have put a lot of effort over the years to make sure we keep this discipline going at a time when there is a lot of many challenges, even in the universities locally, no resources, even the visions for various universities globally. So there's a bit of a pushback for any kind of progress, but many individuals and networks globally have been putting in the work over the years and unrelenting. And so upcoming researchers have this challenge to also come in, think about innovative ways in which we can revamp development and development studies, even get into the lecture halls and share what are these emerging issues that we would like to share with students, so that we do not only train development studies professionals, but people who are also able to practice development in a changing world, development in rural communities. So in terms of publishing and engaging in the hard work of doing research, as Ian has said, and also converting this into ways in which we can share globally, bring in the voices that have been missing, keep the work and networks going, and draw on relations that we also have benefited from. Make sure we keep these collaborations going is another way to think about the future. Because as many younger people are more around innovations, we also need to loosen up, open up space for more innovative ways of doing research. Like Tahira uses the photo voice as a way of doing research, which is both a liberatory, participatory way of doing research, but also one that takes us away from these standard ways of surveys. Surveys have a place in our development research work, but we need to think about more inclusive, participatory ways that break down the hierarchies of what we bring into the field when we join local communities. So thank you so much for engaging us in this conversation. Luckily Ian is here with us in the north working with pastoralists, so we are going to continue engaging, and we really thank you, Ian, for coming in and sharing with us. Happy 60th anniversary to IDS Sussex.
Sure.
I think we already had our celebration last year, so cheering you on, and thank you for reminding us about our strong historical ties and how we need to make this stronger going forward.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great discussion. Thank you.
Happy anniversary to IDS at the university.